as a church congregation. So please welcome Gary McMahon with me.
That was the first time I've ever been clapped for. I don't know how I feel about it. All of the greatest songs ever written, last song reminds me of this, all of the greatest songs ever written were written to the God of Israel and his son Jesus Christ. If you disagree with me, you have the freedom to be wrong. I don't take lightly the chance to do this. It's funny, I love doing this kind of thing, but every single time I do it, it always feels like it's going to go off the rails because I pack so much stuff in. But you get so little time to do it. Time up front in front of a church is very valuable and it's very precious because it's in demand. So I appreciate the fact that your church allows an outsider like me to come in here and do this. You're going back to Acts shortly, and my job is to reorient you back towards that book and that world, and it's a complicated world. So what we're going to do is we're going to start small, and I'm going to put Acts in its proper context, what I think is its proper context, and then we're going to race through the book on a journey. And hopefully there'll be some surprises along the way that you can take into your understanding of Acts. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the book. You can decide that for yourself. And then you can continue on and do verse by verse or whatever Norm is doing that week. But I'm kind of an overview guy, a survey guy, so that's what we're going to do. At its most basic level, Acts is a collection of over 40 stories that tell a larger story about the advance of the gospel outside the confines of its birthplace in Jerusalem. That story is the sequel to an even larger story in the Gospel of Luke, which is a collection of over 80 stories that tell its own story about Jesus, who is, of course, the main character in the gospel proclamation in Acts. Luke, Acts together is one work that's split in half, that tells one story, which is itself the sequel to the even larger story of Israel revealed in the countless little stories of the 39 books of the Old Testament. And then finally, the story of Israel plays out within the grand story of the history of redemption, from the creation of the heavens and the earth in Genesis chapter 1 to the redeemed creation of Revelation 21, which is yet to come in the future. By way of reminder, the story of Israel began when God created a people for his name and led them out of Egypt under Moses. But the story of Israel didn't reach its pinnacle until about 400 years later, when God established David as Israel's king. The story of Israel was an insider story told by, for, and about Israelites, that is, Jews, whose continued access to the covenant blessings came through what God handed down to Moses, and preeminently, for our purposes today, circumcision and the law. And so closely associated was the law with Moses that it was simply called the law of Moses. And in fact, sometimes just Moses. If you read in the New Testament, you'll see, I think you see Jesus say, Moses said, or Moses wrote. And what he means is the law. So the king may have ruled over Israel's physical boundaries, but Moses ruled over Israel's spiritual and religious boundaries. The nation would always remain under Moses from the very beginning. In fact, when Israel was driven into exile about 400 years after David, it was not because they abandoned their king, it was because they abandoned Moses. And by abandoning Moses, they abandoned God himself. But almost 600 years after the exile, 1,000 years after David, God fulfilled the promise he had made to David when the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that her son Jesus, who was a descendant of David, would be Israel's next and final king. And in time, Jesus' resurrection, ascension, and exaltation to the right hand of God would give birth to the gospel proclamation of the first Christians in Acts. However, through Jesus, the story of Israel and the history of redemption would take an unexpected and world-changing, as it turns out, new direction. The story of Israel would no longer be an insider's story told by, for, and about Jews. In Jesus' name, and through redemption in his blood, God would fashion a new and redeemed people of God, not made up of Jews under Moses, but of Jews and Gentiles through faith in Jesus Christ. In other words, God would radically redefine and reshape the very identity of the people of God by welcoming the Gentiles in through faith. But if Gentiles could now take their place among the people of God through faith in Jesus and not through submission to Moses, then the message must go forth. As Paul famously wrote in Romans chapter 10 on his third missionary journey, how will they hear without a preacher? And how will they preach unless they are sent? Which takes us back to Acts, the story of the initial expansion of a new and redeemed people of God into the Greek-speaking Gentile world beyond the confines of both Judea and Moses. And thus concludes my prepared statement. Everything else is slides. We're going to journey our way through Acts. You have the whole thing. You have the finished product in front of you. If you have that handout that Jennifer and Paul were giving out at the back of the church. So there's no surprises here. And you are cordially invited, if you see that I've fallen behind on the slides, to just make a motion. I'm counting on Norm probably more than anybody, because I do it every time. I get ahead of the slides, and then I end up having to go toot, 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 and catch up 2 or 3 or 4 at a time. So that's what we're going to do. And my hunch is there's going to be some surprises along the way, and maybe even some things that Norm's going to have to clear up as you go along in your study. It starts, of course, in, is this all working? Yeah, look at that. It starts, of course, in chapter 1 with one of the most famous passages in the entire New Testament, spoken by Jesus to his apostles just before he ascended into heaven, when he says, "You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And this passage is widely regarded as a thematic statement for the entire book of Acts. So what we're going to do is, you can hold on to that thought. We'll get to the end of the book, and we'll see if you still think that that's the case. And I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying we'll just evaluate the whole situation then. At any rate, we're Westerners, and Westerners often view these kinds of things linearly, chronologically, sequentially. So we naturally assume, since Jesus said it that way, that the gospel is going to go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and then to the ends of the earth in some kind of orderly, progressive fashion. And we're going to evaluate that situation and see how long that takes as well, which now takes us into the second chapter, where there will be an earthquake, shall we say, in the history of redemption. Luke will set up the next event, set the context for the next event, which is the outpouring of the Spirit, with this statement. He says, "There were Jews dwelling in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven," and then he lists them. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Cyrene, and Rome, both Jews and proselytes. And if you say that 100 times, you cannot stutter just like I did. So if you're curious about what he's talking about, this is the eastern third or so of the Roman Empire, and you can see these provinces in areas of the Roman Empire that he's referring to. So you have the first third of them is the eastern side, and then you have the northern provinces, and then he mentions Egypt and Cyrene as well. And if you want a really graphic illustration of what he's talking about, put some circles around it. And you can see it's very visual that the nations that surround Judea, full of these dispersed Jews from the first exile, or from the exile by Babylon, have now come streaming in from all directions to fill Jerusalem, because it's the festival of Pentecost. And they're on a pilgrimage, and it's possible that that pilgrimage is a once-in-a-lifetime venture for these people. May never get to do it again. So it's an outing. And it's possible that many, maybe even most of these people have been in Jerusalem for weeks, maybe even to experience the events surrounding the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So that's the situation with the context. It's very visual, it's very graphic, and you'll see why it matters in a minute. But he uses another word here at the end. He closes this passage with that word right there, proselyte. He seems to say at first that there's Jews there. Then he modifies it at the end and says it's Jews and what he calls proselytes. So you go, okay, well, at one time he seems to be saying there's two groups, but then he seems to be saying they really can be clumped in as one group, like they have one identity. So what's going on here? In order to understand his use of the word proselyte there, you have to understand something about the Jewish mindset in the first century with regard to other people. If you were a Jew, you didn't know how to interact with another person until you knew what kind of person he was and where he sat on the religious hierarchy. So we're going to look at three of those. There's more, but for our purposes, we'll limit it to these three. You have, first of all, through his eyes, the native Judean Jews or Galilean Jews, like Jesus, Peter, James, and John, and all the apostles. They spoke Aramaic. They were born and raised in that area. Aramaic was their native language, and in chapter 6 of this book, they will be referred to as the Hebrews. Then you have the dispersed Jews that have come streaming in from around the empire, who are the descendants of the original exile under the Babylonians in 586, and probably the northern kingdom's exile in 722 under the Assyrians. They're Greek-speaking, and they're called the Hellenists in chapter 6. And then there's a third group, which also makes its presence known in chapter 6, which is the Gentile proselytes. What's a proselyte? Proselyte is a non-Jew who has come into the people of God by formally submitting to, by becoming circumcised and formally submitting to the law. In other words, by putting himself, as has always been the case, under Moses. And by doing so, he's welcomed into the people of God, but he's still a Gentile. And there's a religious hierarchy going on here. And if you want a sense of that, we're not going to see it here. Go look at a layout on the internet of Herod's temple, which was the temple at the time, and you'll see this very graphic portrayal in the architecture of the Temple Mount, which has, the sanctuary itself, the temple, the inner court of the Jews, which is only for Jewish males. Then you have this wall, and then you have outside the wall the outer court of the Gentiles. And so the Gentiles were forbidden from ever entering into the inner court. It's a very graphic portrayal of the distinction, the religious hierarchy of the day. I don't know exactly where the proselytes said on this one. My hunch is they were not allowed in there. Anyway, that's how Gentiles got into the people of God, by putting themselves under Moses and possibly being second-class citizens. Okay, so that sets the stage for the earthquake. Now there's the outpouring of the Spirit. And the world will never be the same, literally. Not just the religious world, the Christian world, the religious world of the Jew or the Christian, but the world in general. And this event, the outpouring, will be closely connected with the next event, which is Peter's proclamation. There's the outpouring of the Spirit through no planning or forethought of anyone whatsoever. And then after that, there will be Peter getting up with no planning or forethought whatsoever to deliver the first gospel proclamation as far as we know. If you ask the question, why was the outpouring of the Spirit, why did God have that event happen on the day of Pentecost? This passage we were just looking at may give an answer. There's probably 10 answers to that question. But one of them is because the nations, it's as if the territory had been prepared for 600 years, right? All these nations come streaming in just in time to experience this outpouring of the Spirit and that first proclamation. So you get a very visual representation of Peter standing there with absolutely no idea what was going to happen. He sees the moment, he stands up under the inspiration of the Spirit, and he delivers the proclamation to the nations. And my hunch is, well, no, there's no way he could have understood the gospel proclamation that he was now delivering 6 weeks earlier. Because 6 weeks earlier, he could have never believed that Jesus was going to be raised from the dead. Whether he understood it even 24 hours earlier is an open question too. But it didn't matter, because now, with the outpouring of the Spirit, everything is transformed. And he delivers this proclamation. And we have this earthquake in the history of redemption. And now, the nations will return. They've come in for this momentous event. They think they've come in for a festival. What they really come in for is this. And now they're going to go back out with the gospel, and they're going to plant churches. They're going to go to their homelands with the gospel and plant churches. One of those churches is Rome. That's the last one on the list. These people, these Jews and proselytes from Rome come in, they hear the gospel, and they take that gospel back to Rome, and they plant a church, which means the church in Rome is a sister church of Jerusalem. That's how I read this. The church in Rome was founded almost as soon as the church in Jerusalem was. All right. Now that church in Rome will continue on the timeline as the journey through Acts, as the events of Acts happen, but it's disappeared from sight. You won't hear about the church in Rome again until chapter 28, the end of the book. But the events continue. And the situation in Jerusalem will be characterized by the two things that were true during the ministry of Jesus: growth and conflict. The apostles will preach the gospel. That will create conflict, and then the conflict will have to resolve itself in some way. And that conflict will eventually reach it will boil over and reach its pinnacle when one of the elders who was appointed for the church in Jerusalem arrives on the scene. So you remember I talked about that religious hierarchy. Well, that came into play in the early church very early in chapter 6. And so there was this trouble because the Hellenists were grousing about the fact that the Hebrews, the natives, their widows are being favored in the distribution. There it is. There's that religious hierarchy. So they appointed 7 elders. 6 of the elders, chosen by the church itself in Jerusalem, full of native Jews, were Hellenists, Greek speakers, non-native Jews. And the first 2 on that list were Stephen and Philip, who are both going to come into play and be critical in the next stage of the story of Acts. But there was a 7th elder who's the real shock, because he was Nicholas the proselyte from Antioch. So the church in Jerusalem, with native Jews and Hellenistic Jews, appoints an elder who's a Gentile, not even from Jerusalem, but from Antioch. And you can see these barriers come crashing down within the church. Through no planning and no forethought whatsoever, it's just events happen, but this religious hierarchy gets now broken down. You also get to anticipate the direction of the gospel here as Antioch is mentioned, and we'll get to that in just a second. At any rate, Stephen now appears on the scene, and he's very powerful in his proclamation and in his actions, and he confounds the Jews, just like Jesus did and just like Peter did. And the result of that is, just like with Peter and just like with Jesus, he gets hauled before the Sanhedrin. But whereas Jesus was silent before his accusers in fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 53, and Peter preached the gospel, thus silencing his accusers, and they let him go, Stephen launches a full-scale assault on the rulers of Israel. There is no sermon. If you thought there was a sermon by Stephen, there's no sermon by Stephen. It's an assault. It's an assault, Old Testament prophet Elijah style, on these people. And so I think it's the longest, it might be the longest dissertation in the entire, maybe in the Bible, I don't know. Luke quotes it at length, which tells you how important it is. At any rate, the consequence of this event this indictment, is that he is stoned. And of course, one of the participants in the stoning is a Hellenistic Jew by the name of Saul/Paul. He's coming, of course. But Stephen is stoned, which leads to a more general persecution of the church in Jerusalem, which then leads to the second, what you might call the second great dispersion of the Jews. The first was 587 BC under the Babylonians, which produces these Hellenistic Jews from around the empire. And now there's another dispersion. Only this time, they take with them the gospel. And so they're fleeing Jerusalem looking for safety. Where do they go for safety? Well, they go to two places. They go to Judea and they go to Samaria. What's the big deal with Samaria? Samaria was full of, the problem with Samaria was the Samaritans. The Jews detested the Samaritans because they viewed them as a polluted people. They were not Jews, really, but the polluted people with the polluted worship. And so they avoided it as unclean territory. So if you're a Jew, you're going to walk around it to get back and forth between Judea and Galilee. Well, this comes up in the Gospels because Jesus he's going to pay no attention to such rules. He's going to walk right straight through both ways. And his disciples are going to be quite offended, probably. We can read between the lines, but very, very, very surprised that he would do this. In fact, to give you a sense of what they thought of Samaritans, if you remember the story, to put it in its context, James and John were the ones who wanted to call down fire from heaven and exterminate the Samaritans. So not a lot of respect there. At any rate, my, how times change. Because now these very same Mosaic Jews, who are now Christians, flee to Samaria in one of the great reversals of the Bible for safety. And of course, when they do that, they bring with them the gospel. And one of those people who goes is Philip, they call him Philip the evangelist, and the reason they do that is because he's the one who's noted for having shared the word of God here. But at any rate, the Samaritans receive the word of God, and the two leading apostles, John and Peter, find out about this. They're still back in Jerusalem. But they sense the moment. My hunch is they're there because they're going to go down with the ship. Their lot is to stay in Jerusalem and die if necessary. That's what I think. But they sense the moment and the need, so they leave Jerusalem. They go to Samaria, and you have another one of the great reversals and ironies of the Bible, where John, the man who wanted to exterminate the Samaritans just a little while ago, it's amazing what a little knowledge and inspiration of the Spirit will do for you, now crosses this dividing line. Not only crosses the dividing line, but he also extends the right hand of fellowship to these people that he wanted to exterminate. And they are welcomed into the people of God alongside these Mosaic Jews. And another barrier comes crashing down. And all of this happens with no prior forethought or planning whatsoever by any human being on the earth. Doesn't matter. The Spirit is there, of course, superintending all this. So now we don't have two churches, one in Judea and one in Samaria. We have the church, as Luke says, of Judea and Samaria. So now we continue. Where am I at? How am I doing? I don't know how I'm doing, but I'm doing. All right, I'm doing. Somebody said I'm doing fine. Good. Okay, the nice thing is, none of you know what I meant to say. You only know what I actually said, or what I left out by accident. That's important for me. Anyway, now I confuse myself. Oh yeah, Philip. So now Philip leaves Samaria, goes back down to Judea, and under the providence of the Holy Spirit, there he is again, the Holy Spirit hovering over the text at this point. He encounters this Ethiopian, this divine appointment. He shares this Ethiopian was at the festival. He's a God-fearing, God-worshiping Ethiopian. He's returning from the festival, and he meets Philip. Philip shares the gospel. He gets baptized. He believes. He gets baptized into the people of God, and he continues on his way. Why does the Ethiopian matter? It's another barrier. He was he is described in the text as a eunuch. Luke uses the word 3 times. What's a eunuch? A eunuch engaged in a practice that was detested by the Jews and was in fact addressed in the book of Deuteronomy, where eunuchs had no place among the people of God. They were forbidden from participating in the life of the people of God. So this man was forever forbidden. He can't be Mosaic. If you don't know what a eunuch is, you can discuss. But he cannot, by definition, he can't be Mosaic. He's barred under Moses. But through faith in Jesus Christ, he is welcomed in, no questions asked. And we see now another barrier come crashing down among the people as this new and redeemed people of God just begins to catch steam under the providence of the Holy Spirit. It keeps on going, and what we see is the disciples are not going to stop. They continue past Samaria, and they head up through Galilee to Phoenicia, which is up the coast a ways, into Gentile territory, then up to Syria, and they head out west to Cyrene, we'll see it in a second, down the coast, and then out to the island of Cyprus. They just keep moving. And then, of course, there's the Ethiopian. And so what we're talking about here is this way and this way. So if you want a graphic portrayal of it, there it is. You can see the reach of the gospel moving out into Gentile territory, and then it can be inferred down to Ethiopia. Which takes us then to the next leg. In Acts chapter 11, there's a critical turning point, and it's expressed by the very Judean Mosaic Jews of Jerusalem in the church, where they make this statement. It's understated, but it's critical. They say, in response to events on the ground, well then, God has granted to the Gentiles the repentance that leads to life. And that statement will mark a turning point in the book, because from henceforth, the gospel is now going to move out under its own momentum, the providence of the Spirit, into Gentile territory. And we're going to leave behind Jerusalem. And in fact, Antioch will now become the ministry center. Jerusalem will fade, so you get a native Judean Jewish character to the church. And now it's going to take on more and more this Hellenistic, Gentile, and Jewish flavor. So we're talking about this place right up here, Antioch. So here's Jerusalem. So it's gravitating up there. Is that all I wanted to say? What am I missing here? No, nothing. Okay. Enter Paul and Barnabas. Paul should get his own 10 sermons. I don't have time for any of that. I'll just say that. I'll sum it up in a single statement that both he and Barnabas are Hellenistic Jews. Barnabas is from Cyprus. Paul is from the province of Cilicia, which we can see in a minute, in a city called Tarsus. They end up in Antioch. To make a great long story short, and they have a very close association with that church. That church has a very evangelistic nature about it. So what they do is they send out Paul and Barnabas on what we call the first missionary journey to the province of Galatia. And then Paul will continue on the second and third missionary journeys to Macedonia and Achaia, and then we'll talk about Ephesus in a minute, which kind of straddles the second and third journeys. But here's Galatia right here, and they did their ministry down in the south of it. That's where you see Pisidian Antioch, Lystra, and Derbe, for example, as new churches. Let's see, that's about it for that. And then on the second journey, Barnabas has now disappeared, never to be seen again. Paul will continue his ministry to Macedonia and Greece, where he will plant churches in Philippi, Thessalonica, from which we get letters, and then Berea in Macedonia, and then he will proceed down south to Corinth, which is south of Athens there, a province called Achaia, but it's Greece. And now there'll be a church in Corinth. This also will be a critical move through no forethought or planning by anyone. Paul is only there because he got kicked out of Thessalonica. That's why he went down there. But he is going to meet up with a married couple, Aquila and Priscilla. Why do they matter? They're converts, they're Hellenistic Jews and converts to Christianity who came from Rome. What on earth has been going on in Rome? They disappeared, but something's going on there. And now they've arrived in Corinth just in time to meet their fellow Hellenistic Jewish Christian, Paul, and his companions, Silas as well as one of them. And those two will develop kind of a lifelong partnership with Paul in ministry. And so at the end of the second journey, they will get on a boat, and because Paul wants to come back to Jerusalem, but he's going to drop off Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, which is anticipating the next move. Paul will continue to Jerusalem. He will come back up to Antioch to say hello and whatever else he did. And then he will hightail it right straight back to Ephesus for what we call the third missionary journey, but which is really just an extended stay in Ephesus. Now the ministry center moves from Antioch, Hellenistic Jewish, Hellenistic Gentile, to the very heart of the idol-worshiping pagan world of the Greco-Roman Empire. Because Ephesus, for example, was home to one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis, or Diana, which Paul will be accused of desecrating, which produces one of the most comical scenes in the New Testament as far as I'm concerned. That's the amphitheater thing. But anyway, Norm will probably talk about that. At any rate, this now becomes kind of the ministry center of this book. And as a result of Paul's work there and others, Luke says all Asia heard the word of God. So where's Asia? Asia's all of this territory up here. And the consequence of that is the seven churches of Asia Minor, 6 of which we don't hear about in Acts, but which I put in here just because they're in the background, but we do hear about them in Revelation. So we have the 7 churches of Asia Minor right here, Ephesus plus these other 6. And then there'll be an 8th church, Colossae. So we get 2 letters from this work that Luke practically brushes over with a single statement. We get letters of the Ephesians and Colossians, and then there's a 3rd letter that was written to Laodicea, which we don't have. Anyway, the 3rd visit then is going to come to an end, and Paul has further designs on ministry. He will write a letter, probably from Corinth, at the end of that 3rd journey, to the church in Rome. And to give you a sense of the stature that church had, even at this point, and Paul's high regard for it, just go read the first chapter of Romans, and you'll see it. Very high regard for that church. It's also his longest and most sophisticated treatise on the God. His longest letter, is it? I think it's his longest letter. Maybe not. But anyway, longest treatise and most sophisticated treatise on the gospel. That goes to the Roman church, which he's never been to before. But it's some kind of, they call it a letter of introduction. It's an amazing letter of introduction if that's the intent. But anyway, that letter's already been dispatched. Maybe with Priscilla and Aquila, I don't know. They end up back in Rome. By the time Paul's going to get there, they're going to be back in Rome. And at this point, he's going to make this statement, which is going to set the course for the rest of the book of Acts. After I have been to Jerusalem, I also must see Rome. And then he plans on going from Rome west to new frontiers, because he wants to bring the gospel to Spain. But this now becomes the guiding principle, or destination. It's firmly set now. The destination of this book is going to be Rome. Okay. So we're just going to leave it up there. Then this is what happens. So there's all of our territories, and this book is going to end like that in Rome. We already know that. I think it's chapter 19. I forgot to look it up again. So we'll keep that in front of us. All right. Now chaos ensues. Paul had a nice, tidy plan. He's going to go back to Jerusalem. Then he's going to head out to Rome, pick up his entourage, however he's going to do that. Then he's going to head out to Rome. It's nice, neat, and clean, right? So he gets back to Jerusalem, and immediately, total chaos. He gets accused of desecrating for the second time a temple. Only this time it's the temple in Jerusalem, because he's accused of bringing a Gentile past that dividing wall. The Gentile's name is Trophimus, and he's from Ephesus, pagan territory. But that's the accusation. The Jews come after him in the temple courts, practically start a riot. The Romans are there in the Antonia fortress right on the wall. They see it. They got on top of this right away. So they come streaming in, and they drag Paul out of there and save his life before he can get beaten to death. And you got to wonder if, what Paul was thinking about this and how much Stephen's name loomed on his mind as he just did his ministry. Because, he's sitting there thinking, yeah, I was the guy that was cheering on the stoning of Stephen. I was those guys that were just going to beat me to death. I was one of those guys. I was part of stoning. But I was successful. We actually got that one. And he's part of the stoning of Stephen. So now here he is, having to be saved by those dirty Gentiles from his own people. So he gets sent. Yeah. Well, wait, let me make sure I got it. Oh, yeah. So he gets sent, one of the great reversals, to no one's favorite place in Judea to keep him safe. He gets sent up to Caesarea by the Romans, which is in Samaria. So once again, there's Paul in Samaria, a place he never, ever would have went to prior to his conversion in Acts chapter 9. Ever in a million years. To make a long story short, they want to try him, and they want to send him back to Jerusalem for his trial. He knows how that's going to end, right? Because he's got a whole bunch of people down there that were just like him, that are just like he was a long time ago. And there's already a plot afoot. So he says, no, that's not happening. I'm a Roman, and Romans have rights, and I appeal to Caesar. I want to be tried in Caesar's court, which means Rome. That's how he's going to get to Rome. So they say, okay, you're going to Rome. So through I was going to say no planning or forethought on his part, but it's more accurate to say in Acts, it's like God goes out of his way to make sure no human plan ends up happening. They all get upended, and here's another case of it. He's going to go to Rome, but he's going to go to Rome God's way, under the providence of the Spirit and not his own way. So he's going to get on a boat, and he's going to have with him Luke, the author of this book. And the man in charge of this little expedition, because he's under arrest, is a Roman centurion by the name of Julius. So it's our second named centurion in Acts. The first one was Cornelius, chapter 10, which, have you done that yet? Have you done 10 yet? Yeah, you'll get there in a minute. Anyway, it's interesting. Roman centurions are portrayed very positive, in a very flattering light in Luke and Acts. Both of them are, and then the centurion who went and approached Jesus earlier in the ministry of Jesus also was portrayed in a very flattering light. But anyway, Luke and Paul, plus some others probably, are now on their way to Rome. And so they take off, they head out. It's an ill-advised voyage because their winter is approaching. And with winter, the Mediterranean Sea can get very treacherous, lots of shipwrecks. So you have to pick a point where you say no more travel. Well, they decided they were going to push it in spite of the fact that Paul said, I don't think you should do this. I think we should stay in Crete and not push. We just winter here. And he said, no, we're going to try to get to Italy. So they take off and they go, and of course, to make another great story short, they end up getting shipwrecked on the island of Malta. Why does Malta matter? Why even bother? It's funny how much text. One of the things you need to pay attention to when you study the Bible is how much text does an author give to particular stories. He said almost nothing about the ministry in Asia. It's 7 churches of Asia Minor, and just all we get is Ephesus. But he labors this thing for more than a chapter. Very interested in this trip. And so they end up on Malta. Why does he care? Well, Malta is different because Malta is not Greek-speaking. These are what Luke calls natives. And he doesn't mean by that barbarians, as we understand the term. He simply means non-Greek speakers who don't participate in Greek culture or something like that. And so Luke, they get shipwrecked on this island, and we can infer that there's gospel being preached here. So probably we have another reach of the gospel or something like that. So they're going to winter in Malta, and then they're going to pick up a ship after winter under Julius the centurion, and they're going to make their way up to the Italian peninsula right here. This is Sicily. by the way. And they're going to hit the Italian peninsula south of Rome. And they're going to take one of the most famous roads, period, in history, known as the Appian Way, which goes directly into it's the road that goes to the place where all roads lead to, Rome. You can do it today. If you want to go to the Italian peninsula, if you want to go to Italy, you can walk the Appian Way. Some of it still exists. You can walk the stones that Paul himself almost surely walked. But he's not going to do it alone, because we now get a sense of the regard that the Roman church had for Paul, because they already got his letter. And, they already knew who he was. Whether they knew him before that, we don't know. But remember, Priscilla, Aquila, and others are probably there. But they have this letter, so they hold him in very high regard. And as an indication of that, they send a delegation 30 miles south to escort him back into Rome. And so it's kind of this great moment where this Gentile, largely Gentile church that's just been growing in the background, it finally meets the great apostle to the Gentiles as he arrives in Rome. And essentially, that's how the story of Acts ends, with Paul arriving in Rome, not to found a church, but to under arrest in this church, where he will now minister with these people. But as part of that ministry, he will encounter conflict once again, and with the Jews. And so he will make the famous statement, he will quote from the prophets, talk about how it was, I don't remember if it was necessary. No, it's probably, you were unworthy. Well and true did the prophets speak about you, in their, kind of like what Stephen said. And then he makes this statement. He makes this statement right here. The second to the last verse in the book of Acts. Salvation has been sent he says to these Jews, salvation has been sent to the Gentiles. Now he meant it, he doesn't say, we're going to the Gentiles, like he did some number of chapters before, which is what he said. Luke has him say this transcendent, I don't know what you want to call it, what's the word for that? Timeless statement that salvation has been sent to the Gentiles. And so you get this sense in Acts. If you were looking for a biography of Paul, you didn't get it, any more than you got a biography of Peter. Peter disappears in chapter 12 with the statement, and he went to another place after he got out of that prison by the angel. He went to another place. He reappears in chapter 15, but then he's gone. It's not a biography of Peter. It's not a biography of Paul. It's something else. And so, as far as thematic statements, let's go back and revisit that for a second. The trouble is, this right here, ends of the earth, that genie was out of the bottle in chapter 2. I mean, the nations got the gospel and took it back to their homelands. It's in Rome, it's in Cyprus, it's in Cyrene, it's in Parthia, all the way over to the east. It's all over the place. So, if you're looking for chronology, that doesn't work. And so, what you have then, you have this. So if you ask me, if I was going to pick one statement that represents, that answers the question, what is this book about? What is Luke trying to say in this book? And remember also, none of those apostles, you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. None of those apostles founded these churches. We don't know who founded these churches. So something else is going on there with what Jesus said. Or he's expanding you. You means more than the apostles. So Jesus says it for one reason. Luke now introduces with it, but he's interested in this. He's a Gentile. He's interested in this. Salvation has been sent to the Gentiles. And that continued. It's like this great, extension of Acts. You could write 1,000 sequels to Acts. The book just keeps going, and it will continue to go. I mean, it started with the outpouring of the Spirit, and that Spirit is still in process of creating and redeeming a people for his name from among the Gentiles. And to this day, it still produces conflict and opposition. But it cannot be stopped. And it seems to me that's the lesson of history. But we have I'm going to close with an example from 20 years ago. We have opposition today. It's really interesting from an analyst standpoint. It's interesting how the opposition to Christianity has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years to become very seductive and so forth in terms of opposition. But 20 years ago, there were some atheists who had a very confrontational, preachy attitude about challenging faith. And the idea that religious faith damages society, retards progress or something like that. And the four most famous of these atheists were Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Richard Dawkins. And you might remember Richard Dawkins' name. He was the atheist. If you saw Ben Stein's little movie or whatever it was, Expelled, he was the atheist that Stein interviewed and made a fool of at the end of that documentary, when Dawkins didn't realize the trap that he had just fallen into. But anyway, their mindset of confrontation, and their attitude about the danger of religious faith came to be called New Atheism. And I'm going to just quote from the Wikipedia page. This is 2003 or 4. It says, New Atheism advocates the view that religion should not be tolerated. Instead, the New Atheists advocate the anti-theist, anti-belief in God view that the various forms of theism, belief in God, should be countered and challenged by rational argument, especially when they exert strong influence on the broader society, such as government, education, and politics. Well, I was not aware that evangelical Christianity held such a stranglehold on public education, but maybe, I don't have any kids, so maybe I just don't know what's going on in public education. But anyway, opponents, like me, have characterized New Atheism as fundamentalist atheism. You can hear the religious connotation of that. I agree with that. That's an accurate statement. The four atheists that I've just mentioned, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Hitchens, and Dawkins, and I forgot the R on Christopher. It's amazing how many times I've looked at that and didn't notice that. Anyway, have been described by critics as evangelical atheists. The preachiness of the thing. So how did this turn out? We're going to challenge religious faith. We're going to overthrow religious faith in our culture because it's so damaging and devastating. We'll see if you can detect the fingerprints of God on the rest of the story. Jan Hirsi Ali, I'm sure I slaughtered her name, she's a Somali, was a central figure of New Atheism until she announced her conversion to Christianity November of 2023. Following her conversion, the columnist Sarah Jones wrote in New York Magazine that the New Atheism movement was in terminal decline. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. Does that story sound familiar? In the book of Acts? Acts chapter 9, Paul sets out for Damascus to stamp out the gospel and ends up preaching it when he gets there. No, first words out of his mouth, I think, were, "He is the Son of God." This earthquake, and its reverberations cannot be stopped because it's the same Spirit. And it will continue until the full number of the new and redeemed people of God have been brought in. And then we will see the return of the King, when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And I would just say to Richard Dawkins, take care lest you find yourself preaching the gospel that you tried to destroy. If it can happen to her, it can happen to you. And that's all I got to say.